going to move on to our third segment, which is the topic of elections, and shifts focus from a national item to how it affects Utah. It's the SAVE Act. So there are two statements, there are 2 points of view with regard to the SAVE Act. There's, first of all, it's intended to strengthen election integrity and simply require people to provide proof of citizenship for registration. It's supposed to make it only eligible for U.S. citizens and establish further better confidence or reinforce confidence in our government, in the public system. The alternate to that is, and the reason why people are opposed to it, is because it requires new document requirements, supposedly. There in Utah is apparently no demonstration that, or demonstrated evidence that people are denied voting opportunity because of their registration. Also, one of the arguments is it disenfranchises eligible voters. And people who lack immediately the access to the credentials that are necessary, they're denied the opportunity to vote. So Rob Bishop, to you, we'll start with our initial 2-minute opening response. Talk to the audience, tell us why stronger citizenship verification in Utah would be important and increase public confidence.
Well, I think we have to realize that elections have always been the core of this country, but not the mechanics of how they are doing. And what is the priority? So when I talk to my college classes, we will also talk, is access or is accuracy the greater need, their greater goal? People don't realize that when Thomas Nast was drawing those cartoons in the 1800s, and he would do a cartoon of an election box, the election box was always round and it was glass, because people saw how you voted. The parties printed the ballots and they were color-coded. Some cases they were scented so you could smell the right vote. And people saw how you voted. When George Washington first went to the House of Delegates, he bought his supporters a round of drinks because people stood to vote for him. That's why in England you stand for an election, here you run for an election. Same thing. I had a grandfather who came over here in the 1850s. He was working up in Alta in the lumber mills, and the owner gave everyone a day off to go vote, presumably for the candidate the owner liked. So my grandfather and his brother voted early in Alta, got on the train, because that's how you went up the canyon back in those days, went down to Salt Lake City and voted a second time, then got back on the train and went up to their home in Kaysville and voted the third time that day. We took advantage in my family of how you could actually get your vote counted as many times as possible. That's why we went on specific reasons to try and make the accuracy more important than the ease of what's doing. And the entire question about SAVE Act is, which is the higher priority? Is the higher priority to have an accurate count of those who are eligible, or make it easier for people to vote? Until last year, I was surprised that my college classes would always say, when I asked which is the higher priority, would always say, no, ease, make it easier for people to vote. Until the last 2 years. The last 2 years they were saying, make it more accurate to vote and make it specific. And that's what the SAVE Act is trying to do, is change our priorities. So accuracy is more important than simply the ease of how you actually vote.
I just want to share some stats if I can real quick. CNN's own polling on this. This is a 90-10, 80-20 issue if there ever was one, because voter ID, 95% Republicans, 71% Democrats approve. 85% of white voters, 82% of Latino voters, 76% of black voters. If there was ever, and by the way, how offensive to be, hey, I'm a little worried about, disenfranchising people who don't know, like every single group is widely supportive of this. My concern is that the SAVE Act has become a little bit of a poison pill with how they've structured. They've put a lot in there. Let's just simplify it and vote on voter ID, and I think that would be an overwhelming support.
I was at the bank earlier today. I had to show my ID 3 times in one transaction. I don't think it's unreasonable to have to present your ID to do the most foundational piece of our civic expression. Like Congressman Bishop said, it is the foundation. Everything else is built on top of this as we express ourselves both in party politics, as citizens, in representative government, as a country. It all comes down to those elections. And the thing that I'm glad to hear that this poll went from ease to accuracy, there is nothing that comes to mind for me that will be more detrimental towards the long-term cohesion of us as a culture and as a country than a continued disregard or mistrust for the outcome of elections, regardless of who the political winners or losers of those election cycles are. If Republicans continue to think and question elections, and Democrats continue to think that there's something nefarious in question elections, if we don't trust the outcome, we will stop trusting one another. And so we have to make sure it's accurate. So in as much as we can get to a place where we know, win, lose, or draw, I would rather know that I lost fairly than to have some concern that my preferred candidate won, but it was through some shady business. Let's know what the outcome is, because that also gives us an understanding of knowing where our fellow citizens in our community are. If we know we don't have their votes right now, then we know we have work to be done to make sure that we're changing the dynamic for the next election.
You know, another issue on that is the difference in the federal law and the state law. And what is that? You go to vote, and if you're voting for our federal congressmen and senators, you get one ballot, because for the federal government, they don't care whether they're a citizen or not. And then you get in a ballot for Utah, where they have to be a citizen in Utah. And what do people think when they're voting? They talk about something obvious and unbelievable, is that they are literally casting votes for, through the federal government that doesn't say you have to be a citizen to vote. Just in Utah.
Yeah, I want to touch on trust that Rob was talking about. When it's no secret that I spent a couple of years of my life battling ranked choice voting, and when the legislature wouldn't give us the time of day, and they wouldn't, we decided to start going to the municipalities that were running those and giving presentations, and it took us, probably cost me about $10,000 personally, 2 years. Wendy Hart and I joke that like two moms in a minivan, like on a mission, were able to one by one present the data that we had collected. And when I would go to the legislators and we would talk about this, I would say, look, it's not necessarily whether or not you can prove that we should trust you. If people have an issue with trust, you have a problem just because they don't trust it. That is your problem. Mm-hmm. And so there's also a microcosm of these elections that are done within the party, of whether we do them electronically or whether we do them on paper, and each side is very opinionated as to which. But I have to say, since I have been the chair, we have always voted on paper, with every poll watcher with full access. We have never had an election contested. And that was the trust, because we could trust but verify. And so every time that I want to say that we've evolved and we have all this technology, and man, we should use it, and how do we do this so things are more convenient, as Rob Bishop said, that they have greater access, which is what a lot of people want, which lends itself to more convenience. I just can never get away from the fact that we need to vote in person, on paper, with ID, and that brings the trust. And that's how you solve it. And I can't, no matter how evolved we think we get, if you don't have the trust, you have the same problem. So.
Yeah, that is definitely what a lot of people here in Utah are saying. And if there's any topic today that we're going over, this to me is the hottest topic. We need to prioritize the integrity of our elections. And if we don't have if we don't have free and fair elections, then we have nothing. So also, shout outs to Steve Aist, because he runs a citizens group, and what he has done is obtained the NCOA data from the post office, and then he has obtained the voter rolls data from the county clerk, and anybody could purchase that through the county clerk. He paid with his own money to have this sorted out to where it would show the inconsistencies of somebody that has moved out of the county and still voted in that election. And we have gone through a few times door knocking, and we have found multiple inconsistencies and many cases of fraud. and we are not accusing that person of committing the fraud, but it's there, and we've verified it, and there's, speaking on the SAVE Act, there is a county here that has more than 6,000 undocumented immigrants on their voter rolls. So, yeah, this is huge, and
I think in addition to the undocumented or non-citizen voters, the bigger question, I think, and the bigger potential for fraud that has probably happened in this country is ballots that are an actual, factual, accurate ballot that was filled out and turned in by somebody that was not eligible to do it. Either wasn't their ballot, or they filled out for somebody else, or they had access to multiple ballots and they turned in multiple ballots.
Exactly.
So, and that's the benefit of this in person and having your picture ID. It's not just about the citizenship. That's addressing one aspect of it, but it's making sure that every person gets one vote. You don't get 10 votes. You don't get, oh, here's a pile of ballots, I'm going to turn them all in. You get one vote.
And with the universal mail-in ballots, like, it's so hard to see if somebody really got it or if it was taken from their mailbox, or somebody else voted. So,
Agreed. So let me mention something. Rob, you talked about voter trust. I think this is interesting. We have a question coming from the audience of a young conservative who served as a state and county delegate in the Republican Party multiple times and has left the party because of the belief that the Republican Party is no longer representative, or that we don't, and this gets a little, we don't have fair elections. I want to speak to that. And if you were to speak to that person in this audience today, what would you say? How are we going to fix that?
I see the disconnect between the Republican Party and them leaving because we don't have fair elections. Like, I'm not sure. So that would be interesting. Man, how do we speak to it? There's a huge effort. There's a big divide as well within the party on, like I said, this idea of convenience and mail-in ballots and voting in person with ID. And it is, as Sarah said, it is the fundamental. I'd never loved the subject of elections, but every time I whittled it down, like she said, it is the number one. If you don't have fair and free elections, you have nothing. Everything else is a facade. It's all a lie. And so I don't think people understood like what was lost as we went away from voting in our precincts, and we had election judges, and we had people in your neighborhood, and you went to your school and you took your kids, and the kids were at the school and they would see the civic process happening in front of them. And I think we've lost a lot from that in the name of convenience. There have been some things gained. People have, talked about possibly sitting around their table with their children having this discussion as they all fill out their ballots. I think you haven't lost that per se as you go and you would do those same things. I would stand in line with my husband. I would talk to my neighbors about, what we were doing and who we had talked to and the process there. But convenience and this idea of convenience is really scary, because what we've done with the convenience is we've also centralized at the same time. And when you centralize, you lose the verification process, and you lose the trust that we talked about before. With the system that we had prior to, we could get same-day results, night of, decentralized, with each precinct recording to their county clerk. And if you were to have corruption, it would have to be within one precinct, with a couple of sweet older ladies who have dedicated their lives to sitting at a table checking their neighbors in. And they all also signed a form saying that they verified the fact that they all counted that stuff together. So the fact for corruption to occur in the old system is much less than it would be in the new system.
I want to move this to just slightly a different place, because the real challenge, it seems to me, it seems to us, and as we're building this, is that it's okay for some error, some minimal amount of fraud. The problem is that that's really a statement about value. It's not a statement of allowance. For example, how about if we made it okay that just a few people were killed in violent crime because it was just a few, rather than because it's important. So my question to you is, if it's a value issue, if it's about if the real issue is making it so valuable that we can't have error. How do we do that?
It's okay to have a little bit of error just because of it's just human error. I think it's just normal. But right now we have a lot of error, and like with what Steve and I are doing, going through these lists of inconsistencies and abnormalities of people moving out of the county and then voting in the election, there's thousands of those. And that is definitely not acceptable.
People say there's not a lot of, they don't investigate it, is because they start with an assumption that there's not a lot and minimal is okay?
Yeah, and I think because our leaders are telling us that there's no fraud.
Well, I think there's a difference between fraud and error. There's always going to be the ability to look back at how you ran an election and see places for improvement. But you should never have this willingness to say, oh, but I'm okay with that percentage of fraud. Like, there should never be an account or an acceptance of fraud as an acceptable level, like as a country, as a state.
Value.
Correct. I mean, fraud should not be acceptable in elections, period, hard stop. Recognizing ways to improve, we should always be willing to do that.
That has always been in our history. That's why I told the story of my grandfather voting 3 times in the election. And not any of that is not acceptable. So the idea has to be 0. That's our goal, which is why we had registration laws in the first place. When we liberalize and minimize the impact of the registration laws is when we actually open the door for mistake. I've always had in my classes kids giving anecdotal stories of how they were away from home, so their mom picked up their ballot, filled it in, forged their name, and sent it in for them. I'm sorry, that's wrong on any kind of a status. And if it happens, we should do everything possible to try and change that. And I think that's what the SAVE Act is trying to do, is change our priority. If people don't want to vote for the SAVE Act because it will make it harder for them to actually vote, they may have to go someplace and vote instead of mailing it in. That's where our priority should be. The idea of zero errors is what our goal is to be. And until we get 0 errors, we should make sure that we don't try and just gloss over it by saying, oh, it's not that big of an issue. It is big of an issue. It's that big of an issue. And it defeats the very trust people have in the election, which is why we need to go back until people are comfortable with the process we're doing.
Well, and keep in mind this too. We talk about the number, like in studies, the number of non-citizen voters who voted, or the number of instances of fraud being relatively small. Again, the goal should be 0. So if it's anything greater than 0, relative is irrelevant. It is too much. My concern is what I mentioned prior too. It's the number of legitimate ballots that were cast by people illegitimately. And that's a number that we don't know, because review and study won't show that. Because if a ballot was turned in by a registered voter that themselves did not turn it in, we won't know that was the case unless the person self-designates that, hey, I didn't turn in a ballot. So that's fraud. So those are actually very difficult to find. We don't know what that number is, but we know that it's substantial. And substantial, you can define substantial however you want. Again, for me, it's anything above 0 is substantial, but it's bigger than the non-citizen voters. So it's not just about non-citizen voters. It's not just about non-registered voters that are voting. It's about legitimate votes that were cast by people that were not themselves.
Well then, Rob, we had an audience question. What does the party do? You determined there was election fraud, there was something that went wrong. What is the procedure?
This is the tough part. There is relatively little that the party actually has a role in this. This is now a function of the state. This is a function of clerks of the LG's office or a Secretary of State in most states, maybe someday here in Utah. It is a function of the official apparatus of government. Now, we certainly try to get volunteers, try to get poll watchers, try to do all of that, but the party doesn't have a role in that. We certify our conventions, and we certify our nomination process through the caucus convention system. Once it goes to the election process, it is out of our hands. We don't have any oversight on that.
Rob, I have a question.
Yeah.
So if the SAVE Act is tied up in litigation and we can't repeal SB 54, is there a way for the party to hold our own primaries, even if we had to change some kind of law.
You would
or
have to have
propose a
changes
bill.
in law right now. The way the law is written right now, we can't run our own primary. And when the Utah Republican Party filed a lawsuit appealing against SB 54, and it did not, the rulings did not go in our favor, it made it clear that we could not ignore the law. And there were certain things that we can't put prohibitions on making it difficult for the signature gatherers. So there's a couple of things that would have to change in state election law, but if that were to happen, then it would be a question of just the logistical challenge of raising the necessary funds to execute your own
Do you
election.
think that would be easier to do than try to repeal SB 54? Would there be
I would, no,
less
definitely not
pushback?
easier, because you'd still have to pass an election law that maybe wouldn't be quite as hard as repealing SB 54, but then you would have the challenge of in the first couple of years, because we did some deep dive research on this, it probably would cost anywhere from about 8 to 12, so let's say $10 million in the first couple of election cycles for the party to run their own elections. That then levels out to a couple of $1 million once you have the apparatus, but those first few times you're building the apparatus.
Under state law, right now, you could do that. You just couldn't nominate anybody.
You just couldn't
Your
nominate
nominee would be on the ballot.
Correct. So we could do all of that, and this is the problem. Current state law, to be clear to what Rob's saying, current state law, we could go through all of that expense, that effort, be really excited, because then the only Republicans that get the nomination would be our nominees, and we would put them forward, and they would not show up on the general election ballot.
Panelists, we're going to go to our action round. We talked a lot about voter trust. I think that's really at the crux of the SAVE Act. So the question for each of you, and we'll start with you, Gail. What is the single most important factor in maintaining public confidence in elections, and what can we as Utahns do to support it?
Well, paper ballots, same-day voting, and hand counting. That's how we can have, good elections.
We'll go this way. Rob Axon?
Agree, and I'm guessing I'm going to agree with most, if not all, of what's brought up by others. So the other action item that I'm going to talk about and challenge folks to do is to teach your children. Teach your children the importance of elections and why they are the sovereigns, that we get to decide, that every Utahn is the one who gets to pick our elected officials through a fair process. So we have to be teaching our kids.
Thank you. Christy?
I'm going to piggyback off of that, and I'm going to say, after you teach your kids, make sure that the delegates understand that there are certain elected officials that have to do with elections that are directly elected, and also your legislators, and make sure that they have similar ideology. And if you continue to put people in that will argue for convenience and electronics, we're going to end up in the wrong place. And so vetting the candidates in the right way, make sure that they have a philosophy of trust but verify.
Excellent.
I know we're talking about values and not politics necessarily, but politics is the art of the possible. If the goal ultimately is in-person, paper and a state holiday where everyone can go and something like that, I think the first step to get there, I'm not sure that Utah has the stomach for that when 90% of people vote by, drop-in or mail-in voting. I think the first step at least is to have voter ID at the very minimum. That'll be the first step. That'll help restore the trust. People have all different varying opinions on how many ballots are not legitimate, how many are cast by legal citizens, whatever. Like, I think the very, very bare minimum, voter ID, of widespread support across ethnicities, across politics. Just to start with that. That'll be the first step, and hopefully we get to Zion someday. But
Excellent.
start with that.
Sarah?
Two parts to this. So, number one, require voter ID to submit your ballot. And number two is remove the withheld category, because Utah is the only state that has a category called withheld. And that means that nobody could see that ballot or see how that person voted, not even the person who is certifying the election. So it's kind of just, there's absolutely no transparency, and that is a huge concern. Another thing is advocating our lieutenant governor to share the voter rolls.
eliminate same-day registration in elections. There may be a time when electronic or mail-in voting can be done effectively and efficiently, but until that can be proven, you don't do it. Until people's fears can be eliminated, you don't do it. And I also would like to make sure that we do registration for voting and give the clerks enough time to do it. That's why same-day registration to me is wrong. Get the rolls that can be there, and also make sure that you purge the rolls at a convenient period of time so voters who are no longer living there don't stay in there over and over and over again.
Excellent.
Could I add just one thing to
Please.
that? Talking about the children, we always took our children with us at all different ages. The day we voted, it was a big deal. We made voting a big deal. We put up a sign, we waved flags, and we went to vote. And so there was a time when two of our children who have October birthdays, and it just fell at the right time, that they were 17 years old when they were elected to be alternate delegates to go to the national convention. And when they got there, it was a big deal as far as media and everything to have these 17-year-olds, because as long as you turn 18 before November 4th or whatever day it falls on, you can do that. And it was a great experience, but they just grew up loving voting because they went to the vote with us.
Teach them the way. Please.
Electronic voting. And I don't want to name names here, but when we follow the money on the organizations and the people that are backing electronic voting, it's never people-driven, grassroots-driven. It's always people who have a vested interest in the outcomes of those elections. I have a huge stack of documents at my house from a file of grammar requests that we have and from a whole list of IT professors. They said you can deliver a ballot, but you cannot return a ballot. And they see no way in which in the near future that you could return a ballot. One actually quoted saying, yes, it's like you could build a bridge to the moon, but it would be very difficult. And so I tend to go with that, but the secondary problem, whether or not you could actually verify some form of electronic voting that would be secure, is you still fundamentally have the trust issue. And so as long as you have the trust issue, you still have the biggest problem.
Well, and that leads right into our last topic, and thank you for that.